Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is actually our final session for our steadiness series. And it is so hard to believe that 8 weeks have passed. We began the resilience and steadiness series 8 weeks ago. And so I want to let you know that it has been an honor to be here with you every Monday and Wednesday at 2 p.m., and I'm going to miss it a great deal. And as I was reflecting back on the journey we've taken, even when we began 8 weeks ago, today's session is just a really beautiful way to wrap things up because the topic is one of my favorites, and it might be the most important skill you can cultivate and see musculature, and as you're aiming to become more steady. And that skill is the skill to strengthen and to heighten or elevate your capacity for self-compassion. So I want to get right to the heart of it all because we actually began laying the groundwork for self-compassion the last time we were together. I am just going to take a moment and bring the slides up. Hold on a second. Here we go. Sorry about that delay. All right, so the last time that you and I were together, I was really focused on compassion, and we talked about the neuroscience of compassion and why this is so important. Just as means of a quick review to kind of reconnect you to the subject matter last week, I want to remind you of these 3 neurological systems that we call upon not very consciously when we are feeling any kind of suffering, discomfort, or threat. The first we know all too well, and that is our stress response. Remembering that when we feel discomfort, suffering, when we feel or we perceive threat, oftentimes we'll go into fight mode, flight, fleeing, leaving, running mode, freezing, shutting down. Remembering that the stress response is always mitigated by the presence of cortisol and adrenaline. Those are the hormones that come in to help us out. We're thankful for those hormones. However, we don't need them coursing through our bloodstream 24/7, as is the case for many of us, because many of us, especially now, are sort of feeling the lurking presence of that external threat that we call COVID-19. Another neurological system that can kind of step in to help us out when we're feeling discomfort, suffering, high states of anxiety, panic, is the pleasure-reward response. Again, this is when, in order to avoid those feelings of discomfort, we will actively seek pleasure or more rewarding experiences or mindsets. And pleasure-reward response in the brain is moderated or motivated by the presence of dopamine. And dopamine is that feel-good hormone, kind of makes us feel calm and soothed, like a big warm blanket wrapped around us, except that once the dopamine wears off, we're back into the discomfort again, which then can lead us into this cycle of discomfort. I'm going to seek pleasure reward. That's going to drop off. I'm back to the discomfort. I'm going to seek pleasure reward. This is how the cycle of addiction can start. Or this is how you might find yourself seeking pleasure reward in ways that are fundamentally distracting to what you're trying to accomplish, diminishing the quality of your life. So we all do this, by the way. We all do this. It makes perfect sense. I'm uncomfortable. I don't want to feel this way. So I'm going to seek pleasure reward. It becomes problematic when we find ourselves caught in that loop. And then there is another neurological system that we can call upon, but we have to do this in a really conscious way. And that is to what Shelley Taylor has deemed, tend and befriend. The discomfort is here. I'm aware of its presence. So rather than fighting it, rather than fleeing, rather than freezing, rather than seeking pleasure reward, I am going to tend to this pain, this suffering, this discomfort. Remember the analogy of the child who's learning how to ride his or her bike. The child falls up and down, up and down, up and down, and then falls and scrapes her knee and it's bleeding. And one of the parents runs to the child and tends to the injury in a very kind and loving way. What does it mean to tend to our own woundedness, our own discomfort, our own suffering, our own stress in ways that are really kind and loving? If we can get into a regular practice of tending and befriending, we bring ourselves out of stress response, we bring ourselves out of that pleasure reward response, and we begin to manage our discomfort in a way that feels very mindful, in a way that is very emotionally intelligent. And the impact of tend and befriend is that it can become our default if we practice it enough. I can't emphasize this enough, that I must practice tending and befriending because it is not natural to who we are as human beings. Very natural for us to go into stress response, very natural for us to go into pleasure reward response. We must intentionally choose tend and befriend. Remember that when we tend and befriend, we begin to self-generate lots of oxytocin. And oxytocin, interestingly, is almost always also accompanied by serotonin. And so we just feel better. When oxytocin is present, we feel less defended and defensive. When oxytocin is present, we just feel more open and spacious and willing to have in our realm of experience the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, the grieving and the relief, all of it. And when we tend and befriend, we actually recognize the value of allowing all of it. We don't have to like it, but can we allow it? So the presence of oxytocin, which comes about when I tend and befriend, offers comfort and stability. So it also can feel like that warm blanket, but it can be sustained. That sense of being protected and soothed can be sustained when we tend and befriend. Gives us a sense of stability, primes us for closeness and intimacy. In other words, if we struggle with that, especially if there's been relational challenges or relational hurts, and I know that I really need to begin to heal around these issues of the heart, the more I can tend and befriend, the more I can reach into that heart and begin to dismantle some of the boundaries, or the what's the word I'm looking for? The armor around it, the fortress around it, so that I can open up. Because part of my humanity, and we all learn this at some point, part of my humanity is the recognition that the degree to which I love is equal to the degree to which I will lose. So when I'm experiencing the deep, deep grieving of the loss of someone I love, through death or departure, whatever it is, when I'm grieving that loss, that grieving hurts. There's no doubt about it. And that grieving also reminds me the depth of this grieving I'm feeling is equal to the depth of the love that I felt. As one mentor told me along the way, when it comes to love, that's just the deal. That's just the way it is. When I choose to love, the depth to which I do that, I know at some level I will feel the same or an equal amount of grieving when that love passes, when that love is no longer part of my life, when I lose. So that said, when I tend and befriend, I begin to almost train the heart out of defensiveness, that defended, armored state, and into that state of being more open. Biggest thing that I want you to remember about tending and befriending is that it will never drain you. It doesn't deplete you to tend and befriend when you're feeling discomfort. It does drain and deplete you when you're in stress response in reference to threat or discomfort. It will drain and deplete your system if you rely on pleasure reward as a way of managing any kind of discomfort, stress, or fears you're feeling around a perceived threat. But when I tend and befriend, and I always have this option, but I have to remember that I have this option and I have to choose it. But when I do that, I always know that it's going to nurture and nourish me. It's going to aid in the repair of my central nervous system. And it's going to, as a result, begin to restore within me a sense of energy and vitality. I can speak for myself, and I know that I'm probably speaking for a lot of you, but I, like you, have lived through some pretty rough things throughout the course of our life. If we were to create our own timeline and draw a big red circle around those periods where there was a lot of anxiety or overwhelm, loss, grieving, discomfort, we know those are sort of landmarks along our journey. If we didn't manage those experiences well, if we didn't cope with the stress we were feeling, and many of us just didn't have the tools to do so, I know that I didn't, central nervous system gets really beat up. And if you really want to know more about that, because it's really important to know about the central nervous system and what happens to it when it gets sort of ravaged by stress, go back to last week's videos, Monday and Wednesday, because I really lay that out. And I talk about how compassion, offering compassion to others, feeling compassion for the self, does such restorative work, reparative work on the central nervous system. And the beautiful consequence of that, or outcome of that kind of work, is that you begin to feel a new sense of vitality and energy. So tending and befriending is really important. It's an important neurological system to call upon when discomfort is present. We did not get to come into the tend and befriend meditation practice last time, and I promised that I would begin the hour with this practice, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I would like for you to come into a very comfortable seated position, and if you'd like, you can also experience this meditation laying down. It's completely up to you. I want you to be relaxed. I'm going to be leading this meditation with my eyes closed. I invite you to do the same, but as always, you can keep the eyes open. If they're open, just keep your gaze forward on one thing and slightly down, and keep your gaze very soft so that the eye muscles are relaxed. So we're going to begin. So we're just going to take the first few moments of this meditation to kind of connect to the support of our seat or the floor that's beneath you, whatever it is that is holding you up. So I just want you to feel the sensation of whatever it is that is supporting you. It might be the cushion beneath you. It might be the sensation of the chair that you're sitting on, the sofa that you're resting on. And maybe just noticing the sensation of the fabric, or if your arms are supported, maybe along the arms of the chair, how that feels. But just really focusing on all the ways in which the body is supported as you're sitting or laying down. Just allowing the breath to be just as it is. On your next exhalation, feel the jaw relax. Next inhale, feel the shoulders relax. Next exhale, feel the bottom relax. And the next exhale, everything is relaxed. And as the mind is beginning to quiet, I want you to bring to mind an image of something that's been weighing on you. A thought that reflects a challenge you're struggling with. Just something that, if it were released, it would just make your load a little bit lighter. So just call that to mind, whatever it is. And now I want you to bring to mind an image of someone who really loves you and supports you. That person that you know you can go to for solace and sanctuary. And I want you to imagine that they've just extended their arms forward in your direction. And I want you to place that challenge, that issue, that burden, that weight, whatever it is, place it in their arms. All of it. If even just for the next few moments, give it all away. Knowing that there is a kindness, a benevolence, a friendship, a strength in your friend who can take this. experience what it means to have compassion flowing in your direction. Notice how it feels to be with someone who is witness to your suffering and seeking to relieve it. And for the last few moments of this meditation, allow yourself to experience how it feels to be the recipient of this compassion. Just allow yourself to rest in the sanctuary that compassion provides. For the next 3 exhalations, just allow yourself to drop a little bit more deeply into this open and relaxed state. And whenever you're ready, but only when you're ready, open your eyes. And just taking a moment or a few moments to just reflect upon how that was for you. In that guided meditation, we had the opportunity to give to another person who was willing to take it, our burden, and willing to hold it there, just hold it there without judgment, with great benevolence and a great willingness to hear and the recognition of your suffering. I seek to relieve it. Let me have it for a while or forever, however it feels for you. So just the act of spending a little bit of time generating the experience, even if it's imagined, of compassion flowing in our direction begins to create the generation of that serotonin and that oxytocin, and moves us out of stress response and moves us out of pleasure reward seeking and really into the experience of tend and befriend. There's someone present with me who wants to tend to my suffering in the kindest, most humane, tenderest way. So that meditation together was about 5 minutes. that's something that you can cultivate within 3 minutes of just sitting quietly. It's a tool that you can use. You can use that guidance. You'll remember it. It's very easy. Just really coming into, kind of a state of relaxation through the body, very, very gently bringing up into your mind and a thought about something that's been really challenging for you as of late. And then the presence of this person who you trust, who you know is supportive and loving and kind, and they're just opening their arms to you. Let me take that for a little bit. Or let me take it for as long as you need. And then just getting to rest in the result of that. Very healing for us. And again, the more I can touch into that compassionate piece, the more stable and steady I'm going to come to feel. And the more I can begin to start integrating, and this is something we talked about in the resiliency training, begin to start integrating that connection, that resonance between the brain and the space of the heart. Tend and befriend is also a really important neurological shift that can also be generated through self-compassion. So if I were to guide you in the direction of the latest, most important and significant research related to self-compassion, I would guide you into the direction of doctors Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer. They generously share not only all of their research on self-compassion, but so many tools, easy, simple tools that you can utilize immediately. And I'm going to introduce some of those today, that you can utilize immediately to begin cultivating this within you. It's so important. So what is self-compassion? This is how Kristin Neff defines it. When I first heard it, I wasn't overly impressed by it until I started using it, and then I really started to understand what she means by it. Self-compassion involves treating yourself like you would treat a friend who's having a hard time. That's it. Self-compassion is treating yourself like you would treat a dear friend who is in a state of discomfort, suffering, who's having a hard time. You know how you do that. If you had to sit down and make a list of the qualities that you display when you are helping someone, treating someone, being with someone that you love who's having a hard time, it's directing the energy of all those qualities back onto the self. So it sounds easy, but it's very, very difficult for so many of us to get to a place where we are self-compassionate. I want you to imagine a stool with its 3 legs. Right? We know that for a stool to be a stool and for a stool to be sturdy and dependable, it's got to have 3 legs. Self-compassion rests on 3 core elements, and they won't surprise you. These are the 3 legs of self-compassion. Self-kindness, what is called common humanity, and mindfulness. Okay? Self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. And this is how this all works. How do I become self-compassionate? Relying on those 3 legs of self-compassion. 1, I practice mindfulness. I really start to notice those times when I'm starting to feel that edginess, that discomfort. I begin to notice when I am in a state of suffering. I begin to notice when something really hurts. And I mindfully observe that pain. For me, again, think about our stress signature. We worked on that at the beginning of steadiness. It's that churning in the gut. It's that beating of the heart. It's the tortured nature of some of my thinking. Ah, pain is here. I am suffering. And it's acknowledging it. So I'm mindful, I'm very self-aware that the suffering is present. I'm mindful. And then acknowledging it, just acknowledging that it's present. But here is where I want to stop myself. I acknowledge that it's present. I'm not going to exaggerate what's here. I'm not going to dramatize it. I'm not going to catastrophize it. I'm not going to minimize it or diminish it. So it might feel really big. It might feel really small, yet edgy or sharp or hot, but it's uncomfortable. Regardless of its size, its magnitude, where it's showing up in the body or the mind, regardless of any of that, I'm just acknowledging that it's here. I'm not making it bigger. I'm not dramatizing it, traumatizing it, exaggerating it. I like to use the word catastrophe, catastrophizing it, nor am I minimizing or diminishing it. Mindfulness, I'm aware that it is here. Common humanity. I'm not alone in this. I talked about the common humanity piece the last time we were together. The common humanity piece of self-compassion is to remind you that in whatever you are feeling, you are never alone. When I say, I know that there are other people who feel this way, or who have felt this way, or will one day feel this way, I am not saying that that means that my pain is somehow less. No, I am saying that I'm not alone. One of the best examples and maybe even lessons of common humanity is what we're experiencing right now. It may have lessened a bit as these weeks have gone by, but in the beginning, at a global level, so many of us, especially those of us who are energetically sensitive, were very, very aware of all of the suffering that was happening all over the planet. In fact, I did some reading about this, and for many of us in the beginning, the global pandemic and knowledge of it literally took our breath away for some of us. And part of the reason it took our breath away, or it felt really, really heavy, is because for those individuals, we were very aware that the suffering was just not in my life, but very aware of the weight and the grieving and the loss and the fear of everyone on the whole planet. So this really strong sense that we're all connected in this suffering. Mindfulness, one of the important legs on that stool of self-compassion. Common humanity, and I'm not alone in this. And then finally, the kindness and the tenderness. Can I hold this discomfort with kindness, with tenderness, and a sense of calm, rather than trying to kick it out of my life, rather than fighting against it? I don't want to feel this way. I don't want to feel this way. Slamming the door on it, beating it up, beating myself up for feeling this in the first place. When I can be very mindful, suffering is here, I'm going to acknowledge that. When I can connect out, I'm not alone in this, sort of imagining the entire planet, holding my hands on this one, not alone in this, no matter what it is. Even if it feels like it's the strangest, most bizarre situation that I find myself in. Somebody out there has felt this before, or who has had a similar circumstance for certain. And Whew, I'm just gonna be really good to myself. When you can do these three things, when you can choose to do these three things and practice these three things, I cannot tell you the kind of perspective and wisdom and understanding that begins to arise because of that. You might remember that the three legs of the stool called self-compassion, mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness are really the three steps to the self-compassion break, which I talked about during our last session. Self-compassion breaks in the moment that I'm feeling suffering, I stop. Suffering's here. I'm real uncomfortable. This hurts. I'm in pain. I'm in pain right now. Step 2, I'm going to remind myself I'm not alone in this. There are other people out there that have felt this way or feel this way or will feel this way. And you know what? Deep breath. I'm going to be good to myself. Might not like this, but I'm going to be good to myself. Practice that enough. And what starts to come up or what arises from that practice is very wise perspective, insight, and understanding. Here's what's really interesting about mindfulness and self-compassion. This is worth spending just a moment on. They need each other. I want to be clear that they can be experienced and practiced as two different things, but they really need each other. They're interdependently linked. So we've done enough mindfulness training over the course of the last 8 weeks for you to know at this point that mindfulness primarily focuses on sort of welcoming what's here, no matter what it is. Again, I don't have to like it, but I'm in calm acceptance of what is. Mindfulness asks, what am I experiencing right now? What am I experiencing right now? Not 10 minutes ago or 2 months ago, not 5 years from now or 5 days from now. What am I experiencing right now? Brings me smack dab into the present moment. And mindfulness says, feel your suffering with spatial awareness. The suffering is here, so feel it with spatial awareness. Spatial awareness means it's here, and I'm going to create a little bit of space between it and me. Suffering can be here, but I do not have to be my suffering. And my suffering does not have to become me. All too often, we get very ensnarled, entwined in our own suffering. Mindfulness says, no, feel the suffering with spatial awareness. Self-compassion focuses on caring for the experiencer. The focus is on caring for the person who is suffering, which is me, self. Self-compassion doesn't ask, what am I experiencing right now? It asks, what do I need right now? This question was a really, really important question in week 2 of the steadiness course. What do I need right now? And part of what I said back then was that this question is so important because what I need right now is different, possibly, from what I needed yesterday, 2 weeks ago. And the example that I gave was what I needed 10 weeks ago at the onset of the global pandemic in my life is very different from what I need now in the context of a global pandemic. So what do I need right now? That's self-compassion. And it's not, what do I think I should need? It's, what do I need? Self-compassion says, be kind to yourself when you suffer. Mindfulness, welcoming acceptance of what is. Self-compassion, focus on caring for yourself. Mindfulness asks, what am I experiencing now? Self-compassion asks, what do I need right now? Mindfulness says, feel your suffering with spatial awareness. Self-compassion says, be kind when you're suffering. So again, we can practice mindfulness and self-compassion as two separate practices, but you can also see the ways in which they need each other. If I never mentioned the word self-compassion, and you were to carry on in your mindfulness-based practices, a natural outcome of practicing mindfulness is that you start to become more self-compassionate. When we intentionally work on becoming more self-compassionate, we have to have mindfulness in order to do that. So mindfulness and self-compassion are interdependently linked, intricately linked. They need each other. So just keep that in mind. Really important slide to include here. And this relates to the science of self-compassion. And I found this to be a real game changer for me, because I can be one of the most self-critical, self-blaming, self-judgmental, self-assessing individual on the planet. And it only causes stress. It only drains and depletes me. There's nothing good that ever has come out of my being self-bullying. Okay? Here's what we know about the science of self-critique and self-judgment. When things go wrong, or we feel like they're going wrong, and we feel that discomfort, be aware. Oftentimes, self-criticism is our go-to when things feel like they've gone wrong. I want you to think about that. If you can reflect upon the last time you felt that something got really screwed up, something went wrong, you're feeling suffering, you're feeling discomfort, notice how you might go right into self-criticism. It's a default that we have. And if you've not gone into self-criticism, chances are you've gone into blaming someone else for the problem. It's just what we do. We just do this as human beings, but notice it. Self-criticism, this is really important, self-judgment, negative self-talk, bullying, activates our threat defense response. This is so important. When we become the inner bully, self-criticism, self-judgment, we actually turn on our stress response. So you might find yourself fighting, freezing, fleeing, or you might find yourself seeking that pleasure reward. Be very aware, mind your own mind. Are you doing this to yourself? We don't need to turn on that threat defense response. We don't, only when we're in true danger. You know what the result of that is? With self-criticism, self-judgment, self-bullying, self-evaluation, being really hard on yourself, we become the attacker and the one attacked. Take that in. Within our own selves, we become the attacker through this harsh self-talk and the attacked. Chronic self-judgment activates and leads to chronic stress and all of its effects. And if you want to review all of the effects of chronic stress, go to week 1 of steadiness. I lay all that out for you. So that's the science of self-criticism. And the science of self-compassion is a response to the damage that we can do to ourselves when things aren't going well, When something goes in the ditch, when something goes awry, when we're feeling discomfort and suffering, please take notice, take heed. Are you going into self-blame, self-criticism, self-bullying? As soon as you notice, take a moment and think about self-compassion, knowing that this self-judgment, evaluation, all of it isn't leading you to a result or to an outcome that's going to be beneficial. It never does. Here's what's really cool about self-compassion. Self-compassion activates the mammalian response system. We're mammals, and this response system is one that brings up our capacity to care, to protect, to nurture, to soothe, and to nourish others. We're all too familiar with our hardwiring for stress, and we're not familiar enough with the fact that we are also hardwired for this very, very nurturing, nourishing response system. Our ability to protect, soothe, nourish others and ourselves. So each time I practice self-compassion, I'm actually strengthening the musculature for this kind of deep, caring, nurturing, tender, loving kindness response system that also lives in the brain and stirs the heart. What I'm trying to say here is that practicing self-compassion is good for you. It is good for all of us at all levels of our being. Benefits of cultivating self-compassion. These are the benefits that have been studied and are the results of the studies by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. Less anxiety, less depression, more optimism. I become much better at what's called reframing. Reframing is your capacity in a very calm state of mind to look at an issue, a problem, a struggle, or a dilemma, and to ask yourself, is there a way that I can see this differently? Is there something that I'm not seeing here? It's reframing in its simplest terms is having something happen, maybe something go wrong or something that you perceive as a failure, and looking at that failure and saying, in what way was this a win? What was the gift in this failure? That's an example of how we can take something that happens and we can look at it differently in a way that serves us, as opposed to a way that takes from us or makes us feel diminished, bad, or wrong. Greater self-confidence. One of the natural outcomes of self-compassion is that over time, I actually start to feel better about myself because I have not been turning on or turning up the volume of that response system that involves self-critique and self-judgment. Those who practice self-compassion have a much higher capacity for forgiveness. You will have a much higher capacity to make amends. A real willingness when you know that you need to go to someone you love and say, man, I messed up and I'm sorry, in a really authentic way. And you really do increase your capacity for what's called perspective taking, the ability to be with people who seem to have radically different thoughts and ideas and mindsets, and the willingness to say, you know, I wonder what it's like to have that mindset, or to look at someone and say, I don't think in the way that you do about this, and I want you to help me to better understand. Perspective taking is actually a lot of fun. Many of us are afraid of it. Many of us are afraid of perspective taking because sometimes we fear If I take the perspective, I might change. But it's really a lot of fun to proactively seek to understand the perspective of another person. With more self-compassion, we become more empathetic. And as you might imagine, my capacity for self-compassion, if it becomes stronger and stronger, fuels my capacity for compassion for other people in a way that I probably never experienced before. It's good stuff, and it only leads to good things. There's a lot of resistance to self-compassion. When I was taking a special training in self-compassion last summer, our instructor spent a lot of time talking with us about the most common myths about self-compassion. And I want to focus on one of those myths for the sake of time. And that is this idea that self-compassion is very indulgent. Self-compassion is selfish. Self-compassion is soft. Because when we talk about self-compassion, we're using words like kindness, friendliness, tenderness, the heart, soothing, nourishing, nurturing. Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer say, don't stop there. There are two really important aspects to self-compassion that really need each other. And they refer to this as the yin and yang of self-compassion. And here's what it looks like. So in the way that I've been talking about self-compassion and the words that I've been using to describe it, I've been presenting it more in the yin way, with that yin energy. And that is comforting, soothing, validating for the self, being with the self, treating myself, an orientation toward the self. So that there is that soft, soothing aspect of self-compassion. But there's also the yang quality of self-compassion, which is about protecting and providing and motivating. And the way that you want to think about the yang of self-compassion, the yin is really directed toward the self. It's like holding the self. The yang of self-compassion is, this is the self now that comes out into the world and takes action in the world from a place of self-compassion, which means the yang of your own self-compassion can be part of how I care for myself is that I protect myself, which means that I might have really important boundaries that I protect, that I set and protect. This is really, really important. This is one of the reasons why, as part of steadiness, we talked about what it means to have a soft front and a strong back. It is a beautiful combination. I can be out there in the world in a really loving, open way because I am completely trusting and supported by my own strength. The strength through my feet, the strength in my backbone, whatever that means for you. The yang of self-compassion is the provisional part. I not only have a capacity to protect myself and a responsibility to do so because I think well of myself, I also have the capacity and the willingness to provide for myself because I ask myself on a regular basis, what do you need? What do you need? And I answer honestly. What do you need to do to have those needs met? Are there people in your life that need to know what you need? What actions can you take to have those needs met, Christine, so that you can be out there in the world serving at the highest level? And then motivation. There is fuel and power and empowerment behind human motivation and inner motivation, that my motivating force and drive comes from the inside. I am intrinsically motivated, meaning that I get up in the morning and I put my 2 feet on the floor and I do everything that I need to do so that I can be here today at 2 p.m. because this work matters to me as part of how I give and serve in the world. I am intrinsically motivated to be here doing this kind of work. And when you are intrinsically motivated, that is a motivation that is so authentic and so sustaining and sustainable and so gratifying. So, what motivates you? And are you committed to the purpose that is fueling that motivation? It's part of how you take care of yourself. So don't ever get caught up in this notion that self-compassion only has the yin energy. This slide is so important, and it's so simple. But remember the yin-yang balance here. Remember that they need each other, and that to be out there in the world and to really be there from a space of steadiness is to embody, because you've practiced, the yin and the yang of self-compassion, the comforting, soothing, validating nature of self-compassion that holds hands with the yang, the protecting, the providing, and the motivating force behind self-compassion. I want to bring us to a close by making a recommendation. If you want to more strongly cultivate both compassion and self-compassion in your life, and you want to do it apart from or in addition to a more formal meditation practice, I want to encourage you as often as possible to participate in random acts of kindness. I don't have time today, but I will tell you that about 18 months ago, I was the recipient of a random act of kindness. I've done a lot of random acts of kindness, but I never received a random act of kindness. And I'll just say that it was one of those acts of kindness where when I got to the cashier at a Starbucks to pay for my coffee, I learned that it was already paid for by the person who was in front of me. And that person was someone I did not know and had never met before. And it had occurred on a day that I desperately needed that kind of kindness. It was a really difficult day, and it really went right to my heart. And I understood in the receiving of it how powerful it is both for the giver of the kindness and the receiver of the kindness. It does the same thing. It opens up that neurological and the heart space of compassion. One person, one thing. Can you decide? This is a practice that Brendan Burchard recommends. He recommends that each day, at the start of each day, you write down in your journal or wherever, you just choose in your mind one person. And that one person on this day is going to receive something from you, maybe an unexpected email, text message, phone call. Maybe you're going to pop a card in the mail. That one person is going to receive you in one very simple way. And it's going to be an offering that they just weren't going to expect. It's like a random act of kindness, except that it's directed in the direction of someone that you know. Make a decision that as often as possible, you will offer words of appreciation and words of applause. In other words, when was the last time and this is something we should be doing on a daily basis. When was the last time you offered words of appreciation to the people in your life that you're really close to? And when was the last time that you showed up as the cheerperson, the cheerleader for someone in your life, and just really applauded them for something that they did or for something that they're doing, however simple, however grand, it doesn't matter. And then finally, making a decision as to how it is that you are going to be on a regular basis a living, walking, talking manifestation or extension of the energy of compassion. And what that means is priming yourself in such a way that this space in the body, shoulders down, heart open, just stays soft. Because as soon as we go into stress response, this part of ourselves gets really restricted. And that extension of compassion, I promise you, is exponentially increased because of, due to your self-compassion practices. So I'm going to bring this all together by saying to you that both resiliency and steadiness absolutely require the practice of compassion, the giving and the receiving of it, and the practice of self-compassion and your commitment to it because of the ways that it can transform your life. So again, I have so enjoyed these Monday and Wednesday hours with you. I hope you have found them beneficial. I hope you have found this entire series incredibly beneficial. I want to let you know that again, if you're here, if you're listening, if you're viewing this at another time, if you're present with me right now, that you now have access to our portal and you've got the entire 8-week series. Every day, lots of different practices, lots of really, really rich content, and really, really, really significant tools and practices that contribute significantly in increasing the strength of your own resiliency, musculature, and your capacity to remain steady in all circumstances. So much love to you. Keep practicing. Be very, very good to each other. And be very good to yourself. Namaste.